Cheryl Ladd was supposed to be the savior of Charlie's Angels. When Farrah Fawcett walked away after just one season in the late 1970s, producers feared the series would collapse. The nation adored Farrah, and replacing her seemed impossible. Yet in walked Cheryl, radiant, professional, determined to prove she wasn't just a stand-in but a star in her own right. To the outside world it worked. Ratings held, critics praised her, and millions tuned in every week. But inside the studio walls, it was different. Cheryl was met with icy silence, whispered insults, and an atmosphere so cold it left her shaken. One co-star, Kate Jackson, made her life on set a battlefield without ever throwing a punch. Their conflict built in quiet, cutting ways until it erupted in a confrontation so intense that Cheryl walked off set in tears. From that moment on, she made a decision she has never once broken. She would finish the work, but she would never speak to Kate again. Decades later, the silence remains. The question is, why? Before Cheryl Ladd became a household name, her story looked very different from the glamorous image she later projected on Charlie's Angels. In the early 1970s, she was not even acting on screen. She was singing into a microphone, working behind the scenes on animated projects. Few fans know that her voice carried through Saturday morning television as Melody, the perky blonde from Josie and the Pussycats. It was steady work, but hardly the kind of career that promised stardom. Cheryl wanted more. She wanted to be seen. But Hollywood was never kind to newcomers, especially young women who were told their looks mattered more than their ability. Cheryl hustled from one guest spot to another, picking up roles on forgettable television pilots, low-budget films, and anything else that kept her dream alive. Casting directors often dismissed her. She was told she was too pretty, that audiences wouldn't take her seriously. Years passed this way, and by the mid-70s, she was close to giving up. Friends recalled her questioning if Hollywood was worth the heartbreak, if a simpler life away from the cameras might be the better choice. And then came the phone call that would change everything. In 1977, television was dominated by one phenomenon: Charlie's Angels. The show had only just premiered the year before, yet it was already a cultural sensation. Farrah Fawcett's feathered hair, dazzling smile, and bubbly charisma had turned her into America's sweetheart overnight. Posters of her hung in millions of bedrooms. Ratings skyrocketed. But behind the scenes, Farrah was restless. The grueling shooting schedule clashed with her marriage, and she longed for film roles that would prove she was more than just a television beauty. After just one season, she shocked the industry by walking away. The producers were in panic mode. They had a hit on their hands, but without Farrah it could all crumble. Replacing a star that beloved was like trying to replace lightning in a bottle. Networks whispered about disaster. Tabloids speculated about cancellation. But the show's creators made a bold choice. They would not bring in a carbon copy. They would not pretend Farrah never existed. Instead, they reached out to Cheryl Ladd and asked her to play a new character, Chris Monroe, written as Farrah's younger sister. It was a gamble. For Cheryl, the offer was both exhilarating and terrifying. This was the break she had dreamed of, yet it came with enormous pressure. She was not only stepping into a role, she was stepping into a cultural spotlight that still belonged to someone else. From the moment the announcement was made, the media framed her as the replacement. Fan magazines questioned whether audiences would ever accept her. TV critics sharpened their knives, ready to declare her a flop. Still, Cheryl walked onto that set with poise. In interviews, she smiled and projected optimism. She promised she wasn't there to replace Farrah, only to continue the story. When cameras rolled, she delivered her lines with a mix of charm and vulnerability that began to win audiences over. Ratings remained steady. Slowly, the fans warmed to her. On paper, it was a success. The show survived. Cheryl was no longer struggling to find her place in Hollywood. She had it. But beneath the surface, something else was beginning to form. From the moment she arrived, Cheryl could feel it. The air on set was charged, the atmosphere tense. Farrah's exit had left wounds that had not healed, and Cheryl was stepping into a room where not everyone wanted her there. She had proven herself to the audience. Now came the harder test, proving herself to the people standing just a few feet away from her on set. By the fall of 1977, Charlie's Angels had steadied itself with Cheryl Ladd now in the lineup. At first, the skepticism was obvious. Fan magazines were blunt. Could Cheryl possibly measure up to Farrah Fawcett? Newspaper columns wrote of the impossible task she faced. Yet, Cheryl handled it with striking calm. She didn't lash back at critics or try to compete with Farrah's image. Instead, she leaned into her own strengths. She brought a softer energy to Chris Monroe, portraying her not as a glamorous icon, but as the approachable, younger sister, who was eager to prove herself. Audiences noticed. The ratings, which many expected to tumble, held firm. In some weeks, they even rose. Children hung posters of Cheryl next to Farrah's. Housewives tuned in and wrote fan letters praising her warmth. The audience had accepted her. But inside the studio, where lights glared and scripts piled up, a very different story was playing out. Cheryl would later describe those early days as walking on eggshells. From the moment she stepped on set, she could feel the gap between what viewers saw and what she was actually living through. The atmosphere wasn't filled with screaming fights or public meltdowns. It was quieter than that. More subtle, averted glances in the makeup room. Crew members who chose to hover near the original cast, but not near Cheryl. Lunch breaks where she sat with her script while the others huddled together in whispered conversation. The distance was palpable. Jacqueline Smith, the most even-tempered of the group, tried to remain neutral. She had an easy grace about her and treated Cheryl with kindness. But even she couldn't erase the wall that was forming. The wall wasn't made of words, it was made of silence. And silence can be louder than anything. For Cheryl, every day became a test of endurance. She would show up early, prepared, eager to prove that she wasn't just the new girl parachuted in. She was determined to bring her best, no matter what. Yet she couldn't ignore the icy undercurrent. She wasn't Farrah, and in some people's eyes, that meant she could never belong. Hollywood insiders who visited the set picked up on it quickly. One director later recalled how Cheryl was always smiling, always gracious, yet often alone. The message was clear. The producers might have chosen her, the audience might have loved her, but within the cast, she was an outsider. By the second season, the contrast became stark. On magazine covers, Cheryl looked radiant, arm in arm with her fellow angels, photographed in coordinated outfits under bright studio lights. The public image screamed unity, but once the cameras stopped clicking, Cheryl often found herself back in her dressing room, separated not by walls but by coldness. It was a painful irony. Millions of fans embraced her with open arms, but the very people she worked beside resisted. And at the center of that resistance, one presence loomed larger than all the others. Kate Jackson. Kate had been there from the beginning. She was the serious angel, the one critics praised for grounding the show in something more than beauty and action. She had carved out influence, not only on screen but behind it, shaping the creative direction in subtle ways. And she did not welcome Cheryl's arrival. At first, it was little things, sarcastic comments, rolled eyes during table reads, the refusal to meet Cheryl's gaze when scenes were rehearsed. Crew members whispered about it, sensing a growing divide. To Cheryl, who entered the show determined to prove herself, it was crushing. She was no diva, no troublemaker. She just wanted to work hard, to be accepted, to belong. But no matter how many fans cheered her on at home, no amount of magazine covers could erase the feeling she carried every day on set, that she was being kept at arm's length, by one co-star in particular who had no intention of letting her in. By 1978, the tension on the Charlie's Angels set had stopped being something that could be brushed off as nerves or simple adjustment. It had become clear to everyone who worked there. Cheryl Ladd and Kate Jackson were not on the same page, and they never would be. Kate was the anchor of the show from the beginning. Critics praised her for bringing weight and intelligence to a concept that many dismissed as little more than glamour and stunts. She was proud of that role. She wanted the series to prove that women could carry primetime television with wit and grit. But as the show's popularity grew, so did Kate's frustrations. She watched the scripts lean more heavily into glossy fashion shots, choreographed fights and cheesecake moments for the camera. And when Cheryl arrived, Kate saw it not as a necessary replacement, but as a symbol of everything she thought the show was losing. According to people on set, Kate didn't hide her feelings. In conversations that trickled down to the crew, she allegedly dismissed Cheryl as another blonde Barbie doll, a cutting remark that traveled fast and stung deeply. It wasn't just about looks, it was about credibility. Kate felt the show had traded substance for style, and to her, Cheryl represented that trade. What followed wasn't explosive at first. It was the steady erosion of any chance at friendship. During table reads, Cheryl would offer small suggestions, maybe a different delivery or a way to add nuance. Kate often cut her off or spoke over her. During breaks, Cheryl's attempts at conversation were met with clipped replies. In scenes, Kate sometimes refused to make eye contact, an icy gesture that didn't go unnoticed by cast and crew alike. Jacqueline Smith, the third angel, sensed it all too well. She had always been the diplomat, warm and approachable. But even she admitted years later that the energy shifted when Cheryl entered the room with Kate. The tension was like a third presence in the space, invisible but undeniable. The crew began to whisper about it, sometimes joking, sometimes concerned. A cameraman once described the set as cold enough to see your breath. For Cheryl, it was isolating. She had stepped into a role under immense public pressure, delivered results for the network, and won the audience over. Yet on set, she was still treated as the outsider, the intruder who didn't belong. Cheryl never retaliated. That wasn't her nature. She believed the work should speak for itself. She showed up early, stayed late, learned every line, and poured her professionalism into the job. But professionalism has its limits when faced with relentless undercurrents of disdain, and Kate's resistance was not softening with time, it was hardening. To some who watched from the sidelines, it looked like a power struggle. Kate had always been the serious one, the actress with clout, the one who gave the show its credibility. Cheryl's presence, whether she intended it or not, shifted that balance. Producers leaned on her, wrote storylines around her, and began framing her as a central emotional core. What was meant to save the show was, in Kate's eyes, reshaping it into something she hadn't signed up for. By the late 70s, that resentment wasn't whispered anymore. It was visible. Sarcasm at the table reads, eye rolls during interviews, a coldness so obvious that even casual fans would later claim they sensed something was off between the two women on screen. Cheryl bore it all quietly, but the silence was starting to crack. Resentment, when left unchecked, only festers, and in time, all the whispered barbs and subtle slights would boil over into a single, unforgettable confrontation. One that Cheryl Ladd never forgot and never forgave. By 1979, the unspoken conflict between Cheryl Ladd and Kate Jackson had reached its limit. For nearly 2 years, Cheryl endured the cold silences, the cutting remarks, and the knowledge that no matter how hard she worked, she would always be seen as the outsider. She was professional, unfailingly so, but professionalism can only shield so much. The pressure was mounting, and everyone on set could sense it. Something was about to give. The moment came during production on an episode that required extensive rewrites. The story had shifted at the last minute, and producers decided to expand Cheryl's role, giving Chris Monroe a more emotional arc. It was a pivotal chance for Cheryl, not just as the new Angel, but as an actress showing she had depth. She was excited. She saw it as validation, a sign that the writers believed in her. Kate, however, saw it differently. To her, it felt like yet another erosion of her influence, another step toward the show becoming more about surface appeal than substance. When the revised script landed in her hands, witnesses say she slammed it down, her frustration spilling out in full view of the crew. She stormed off set, leaving an air so tense that everyone froze in place. What happened next unfolded away from the cameras, but the echoes of it spread quickly. Kate confronted Cheryl in a dressing room. No one knows every word spoken, but crew members nearby heard the raised voices, the shouting, and then a door slammed so sharp it rattled the hallway. Moments later, Cheryl emerged, shaken and visibly upset, her eyes red as if she had been crying. For the first time since joining Charlie's Angels, she didn't return to finish the day's work. She walked off set. For Cheryl, it was a breaking point. Months of silent exclusion had built to this moment. She had tried kindness, patience, and diplomacy. She had tried to fit in without competing, to bring warmth where there was coldness. But the confrontation made one thing clear. No amount of effort would ever change Kate's stance. And Cheryl, for all her resilience, had reached her limit. Producers scrambled. Charlie's Angels was still a top show, and the last thing they needed was headlines about its stars falling apart behind the scenes. Meetings were arranged, compromises suggested, and apologies were floated. But Cheryl was done chasing peace. She had made a quiet decision in that dressing room. She would not fight with Kate, but she would not forgive her either. From that point on, the relationship was strictly business. Lines would be read, scenes would be filmed, but off-camera the silence would be absolute. The change was stark. Crew members later recalled the shift. Icy glares between takes, promotional tours where the two women sat in the same car but didn't exchange a single word. Photo shoots that required careful staging to keep them at opposite ends. The atmosphere, once awkward, had now become openly hostile. And yet, to viewers at home, nothing seemed amiss. The Angels smiled, posed, and carried out their adventures week after week. Fans tuned in by the millions, unaware that behind those glossy network promos, two of the show's brightest stars could barely stand to be in the same room. For Cheryl, the choice was final. She would finish her time on the show with professionalism, but she would never again attempt friendship, reconciliation, or even casual conversation with Kate Jackson. It was a line she drew in silence, and one she has never crossed, not even decades later. When the confrontation with Kate Jackson ended in that dressing room, Cheryl Ladd's decision was made. She would remain civil for the sake of the cameras, but beyond that, she was finished. And unlike many feuds in Hollywood that fade with time, Cheryl's resolve never wavered. What began as professional coldness grew into a silence that lasted decades. In the early 80s, after Cheryl had firmly established herself as a core part of Charlie's Angels, the press began speculating about the chemistry between the three women. Public appearances still showed bright smiles and glittering gowns, but insiders noticed the strain. Cheryl would skip certain promotional events, often citing scheduling conflicts, yet people who worked on the show whispered that her absence was deliberate. If Kate was going to be there, Cheryl would not. As the years passed, the opportunities for reconciliation came and went. Reunions were planned, tributes were held, anniversaries of the show's debut were marked. Jacqueline Smith, ever the peacemaker, participated gladly, reflecting warmly on their time together. Cheryl, however, remained elusive. Her refusal to stand next to Kate was not an accident, it was a boundary. In the early 2000s, Cheryl finally gave the world her most telling answer. During a career retrospective interview, She was asked if she stayed in touch with her fellow angels. She smiled, spoke fondly of Jacqueline Smith, and then the question came, "And what about Kate Jackson?" Her response was just one word: no. She didn't explain, she didn't elaborate. But that single syllable carried more weight than any lengthy statement could have. It confirmed what fans had long suspected: the fracture had never healed. Meanwhile, Kate's silence took a different form. Throughout the 90s and 2000s, she gave few interviews and rarely spoke about Charlie's Angels. When she did, it was often with deflection, a light laugh, or a simple, "I've moved on." Those close to her suggested that her resistance to Cheryl wasn't just personal. Kate had been struggling with health issues, undergoing multiple surgeries, while also battling burnout and disappointment in the show's direction. She had wanted Charlie's Angels to be about substance, about dramatic tension and strong storylines. Instead, she watched it lean further into glossy spectacle. To her, Cheryl's casting symbolized that shift, whether fairly or not. Still, even with that context, Kate never sought reconciliation. She never apologized, never offered clarity, never reached out in private. For Cheryl, that silence spoke louder than words. Whatever sympathy she may have felt for Kate's struggles, she accepted one truth: the bridge between them was not only broken, it was burned. Fans, meanwhile, pieced together the puzzle. Online forums in the early internet era buzzed with speculation. Viewers rewatched old episodes, pointing out stiff body language, the way Cheryl and Kate rarely made direct eye contact, the subtle tension that seemed to seep through even in scripted scenes. To the casual viewer, it was invisible. But to loyal fans, it became part of the intrigue. The idea that the real drama of Charlie's Angels was unfolding when the cameras weren't rolling. Over time, Cheryl's silence took on its own power. In an industry where grudges are often paraded for publicity, she never cashed in on her pain. She never launched public attacks, never penned tell-all books about the feud. Instead, she chose dignity. She lived her life, built a long career in television, movies, released music, published books, raised a family, and stepped gracefully into her role as a Hollywood veteran. Her refusal to engage in false pleasantries was not about bitterness, it was about boundaries. Even today, when asked about forgiveness, Cheryl answers carefully. She speaks about grace, about letting go, about moving on. But she also believes in protecting one's peace, and sometimes that means walking away without looking back. Her silence toward Kate Jackson has lasted more than 4 decades, and in that silence lies the final word. Cheryl Ladd's story is not only about what happened on the set of Charlie's Angels, it is about what she chose to do afterward. She could have lashed out, written exposés, or built a second career on rehashing a feud. Instead, she chose silence, a silence that was louder than any headline. For Cheryl, walking away from Kate Jackson was not about bitterness. It was about dignity. She understood something many in Hollywood never learn: you don't have to make peace with everyone to live in peace yourself. In the decades since, Cheryl has shown exactly that. She built a career beyond the shadow of Farrah Fawcett, beyond the cold wars of a television set, and beyond the bitterness of one broken relationship. She starred in dozens of films, recorded music, raised her family, and became a symbol of quiet resilience. Fans see her today not as the replacement, but as a woman who carved her own legacy. And yet, the silence between her and Kate Jackson endures. Some wounds never heal, and Cheryl's refusal to look back is her way of proving that survival sometimes means walking away and never turning around. For more emotional stories, check out this video.